For those of you who haven't heard about us, we launched in 2007, and it's a province-wide initiative to try to address the increasing racialization of poverty in this province and the resulting inequities that are faced by racialized groups. But some of you may have seen our video, Go Ethnic Go, which is in response to Mr. Jason Kenney's strategy to go after the very ethnic votes. So I encourage you to look at that video. I want to thank John for inviting us and for all of you to be here tonight, because one of the things that at Color Poverty Campaign we've been talking about this issue, and which is how to increase economic literacy among the general public. Because I know that there are a lot of sort of people out there, TD banks, and sort of like. Sometimes it's because they lost in some class action lawsuits, so they have to spend money somewhere. So they spend money on increasing financial literacy among the average Canadians. And of course, the idea is that, to convince people that you're poor because you don't know how to manage your money. And it also kind of reinforces some of the problems that many of us are talking about tonight. So much so that, when you go out and talk to some of the, take some of my relatives, for instance, many of them who are probably would benefit from a progressive tax system are somehow convinced that, lower income tax is good for them. So I think that it's important how do we think beyond speaking to the converted, like the group here tonight, and how do we even broaden that conversation so that more and more people are thinking about these issues. So certainly this is a good place to start. And many of the issues, certainly I would echo, like, the important issues around progressive tax system, better child benefits, all of those are important to racialized communities as well. And in particular, people working in precarious job situations, many of them, and the majority of them are racialized. But for our campaign in particular, we're particularly concerned about racialization of poverty because although I think in general many Canadians now understand there is a huge gap between the rich and the poor, but I think there are fewer people who understand that the gap is particularly significant for people who are from racialized communities. So, for instance, you may or may not know racialized groups are 2 to 3 times more likely to live in poverty compared to members of other community. So in 2005, that means 19.8% of racialized families live in poverty compared to 6.4% for non-racialized families. And United Way Post-Poverty by Postal Code report shows, for instance, between 1981 to 2000, poverty rate among non-racialized groups in Toronto dropped by 28%, and over the same time period, poverty rate for racialized communities increased by 361%. And between 1996 to 2001, racialized group members and newcomers, many of them are racialized, sustained a double-digit income gap and a higher rate of low income. So the median after-tax income for racialized persons was 23.2% lower than that of non-racialized groups in 1996, and in 2000 that was 13.3%. And of course, there's a gendered aspect as well. Anything that is applied to men is worse for racialized women. And also a more recent study shows that there are color code that is keeping visible minorities out of good job in the Canadian market. So the report by Wellesley Institute and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives found, for instance, that visible minority Canadian workers earned 81.4% for every dollar paid to their Caucasian counterparts. And that color code persists for second-generation Canadians. So racialized groups who are born in Canada, they still make less money as compared to non-racialized groups, given the same level of education. So you cannot blame that on their immigration status, for instance. So, and they also, racialized groups also sustain higher unemployment rate. So for instance, in 2006, their unemployment rate was 8.4% compared to 6.2% for white Canadians. And more disturbingly is that visible minorities are underrepresented in the public administration, like, public sector, while 92% of workers there are white. So with all those kind of issues, and certainly there's an underlying sort of tension and cause of systemic racism, which most people don't want to talk about, including our civic leaders and sometimes the general public as well. So I think one of the biggest challenge that we actually have is to convince people that there is a systemic racism that still exists in Canada before we can even start talking about the solution. So, but assuming that we have convinced people that there is systemic racism, then what are some of the solutions? Well, the solution has to be structural and systemic in nature as well. So some of the things that we have highlighted, for instance, at the federal level, we suggest that the government should adopt and implement the recommendations in the Senate report on poverty, housing, and homelessness. They should bring back the long-form census. Why is that important? Because it is from the long-form census that we realize how bad the situation is, and I guess that's part of the reasons why they want to get rid of it. And in fact, we were part of the court challenges that was launched on this issue, and so we're still waiting for the federal court decision on that. We also want the federal government, to reverse many of the amendments that were contained in the recent federal budget. Some of you have mentioned, the 15% wage cut to temporary foreign workers, changes to the EI system. But there's another change as well that most Canadians are not aware of, and that is they remove this equivalency requirement in the Federal Employment Equity Act, so that companies, including universities and other suppliers who do contract with the federal government, basically they no longer have to meet the employment equity requirement. So we want that to be changed. We want them to reverse the change to the interim federal health program for refugees that they're very concerned about. Like Dina's group, we also think that temporary foreign workers should be granted permanent resident status. At the provincial level, we want the provincial government to bring back mandatory employment equity, which we once had for a very short period of time, so that we can level the playing field for all racialized communities as well as other marginalized groups. We want them to strengthen employment standards legislation that Dina talked about and extend that protection to all temporary foreign workers. We also want equal access to publicly funded education because, in fact, that's one of the issues that many racialized youth face today. They face higher dropout or push-out rates. They don't see the curriculum reflecting their experience and identity, and that contributes to their inability to reach the same level of success as other non-racialized groups. We also want the provincial government to collect and track disaggregated data across all ministries to find out who are the poor, how are they benefiting from changes, both positive and negative, from the various policies that government has implemented. So for instance, if child tax benefits is benefiting children, we want to know that all children are benefiting equally. And you need data to know that. And finally, at the municipal level, so since we're here, might as well talk about it, even though nothing will probably come out of it. But anyway, so we want to implement and expand the city's employment equity policy to include contract compliance on all suppliers and contractors who have business with the City of Toronto. And we want to make sure the city applies their own equity and human rights policy to ensure that all their decisions, whether when they're talking about cuts to the first services or whether they're implementing new policies or practices, that they make sure that all of these practices or policies or cuts will not have disproportionate impact on people who are the most vulnerable. So those are just some of the ideas that we have. Thank you. Oh, sorry, by the way, I guess Michael or somebody is distributing some flyers. Yeah. So take a look at our flyers about the campaign and the employment equity program.